Thanks for all being here. It's great to see so many people here for UNA USA Members Day. We always look forward to this day within the UN Foundation and at UNA USA, and it's really great to, just to see so many faces out there that are interested in UN issues, care about UN issues, and want to know what they can do to help move the US-UN relationship forward and help the UN do all the important work it's doing around the world. Thank you, Ginger, for the kind introduction. I'm Robb Skinner. I'm the Senior Director for UN Relations and Special Initiatives at the UN Foundation. And we have a really great panel to talk about Rio+20, moving forward from Rio+20 and just what we have in front of us on the Sustainable Development Agenda, as well as what's coming next on the Millennium Development Goals. Ginger has managed introductions. I don't think we'll go through that again, but I would like to say I do think that Patrick Madden and Deputy Secretary General Eliasson got us off to a great start this morning on the UN agenda. I think we could all see again, as Patrick indicated, why the Deputy Secretary General was such a great choice. He really delivers the message of the UN very well, talks about the issues we all care about, and makes it real, really brings it home and lets us know what we can do as citizens, as supporters of the UN, to help the UN and do its job. So, we have Nikhil, Minh-Thu, and Eban are going to answer a couple of my questions first. I'm going to do a couple of rounds of questions with them, and then, of course, we're going to open up the floor. What we really want to do is have a conversation. We want to hear from you, hear what you think about what's happening on the Sustainable Development Agenda, and also provide the information that can help you be connected with what's happening over the next several years on that agenda. So I'm going to start with Nikhil, the Director of the Division for Sustainable Development and at the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. Nikhil has followed up to the Rio+20 and after Rio+20 very carefully. He's dealing with member states, dealing with the entire UN system. So, in that role, Nikhil, a lot's happened since Rio+20. I mean, there's been some significant developments. Just where are we? We're 8 months out from Rio+20 just about, and since June, where are we and where are we going?
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Ginger, for that introduction. Let me see where I should start answering your question, because so much has happened since Rio that trying to capture all that in the time that you've given to me is going to be a challenge. But let me go back to Rio and try and give you an appreciation of what Rio was all about. Sometimes in these big conferences, you tend to evaluate the conference on the basis of the political outcome document alone. And the yardstick you use to evaluate it is what is in that document and what is not in that document, a minute examination of that. But what I want to tell you today is, first, there is no single outcome on which you can evaluate Rio. I want to talk about the plurality of outcomes at Rio, and that's what I want to leave behind with you. But more fundamentally, what did Rio do? That is the question I want to start with. I think that if you read through the document and you get a sense of what the 50,000 people who were at Rio in the biggest UN conference ever, what were they trying to convey to the world? And I think the message was very simple, that we need to rethink development. And what are the elements of this rethink of development that Rio captured? First, I would say that poverty eradication and the associated deprivations of poverty, which Patrick Madden, for example, outlined, were at the core of the political outcome of Rio. Second, we have to tackle inequalities and social inclusions, which was at the core of Rio. Third, the concerns for people has to be matched with the inseparable concern for the state of our planet Earth. Next, we need a balance between the needs of current and future generations, and this is the basic rethink. And to do this rethink, Rio called for urgent and immediate actions built around the need to, firstly, integrating the economic, the social and environmental issues and decision-making. You can't pursue these in isolation. That was the message from Rio, that till you integrate people's economic aspirations, their social aspirations, and their environmental concerns, you'll be making unsound decisions. Second, focus on implementation. There are too many promises that have been made over the last so many decades, but it's time to focus on implementation, implementation, implementation. Show us what have you done as a result of these global policy frameworks that you establish. Third was by promoting the coherence of institutions. In achieving all this, what did Rio argue for? It firstly argued for the engagement of all, civil society in particular, and this meeting today, the enthusiastic response to this meeting, your participation here, the work of the US UNA, I've been to the Westchester chapter meeting, for example, that kind of engagement is crucial for the achieving what Rio had argued for. Secondly, they argued for a stronger scientific basis for action. Third, the importance of innovation. Fourth, the importance of partnerships. Fifth, the importance of resources, technology, and capacity building. And they developed new tools like the green economy as a way to inspire change. I'm giving you this broad picture to make the point that this fundamental rethink of development, the orientation of approaches and the means to make this happen should not be forgotten as we devise ways of moving forward. And this rethink, if you keep this rethink in mind, this will give you a segue into what I have to say about Rio+20 and what Minh-Thu will cover in going up to 2015. Because this is part of a way, part of the same process. It's part of the way in which the international community is trying to focus on what has gone wrong. And it's clear from the kind of environmental, the economic, financial, and social crisis that we face today that we're heading towards a storm, or a kind of perfect storm of these crises, and that is the fundamental sort of rethink which Rio had tried to bring about. So that's my fundamental message to you, that Rio tried to do this. But how, in the way the political outcome was designed, did Rio address this? First, I briefly mentioned to you the idea of a green economy, where you focus on efficiency, you focus on sustainability of consumption and production, you look at ways in which these issues can be addressed, decarbonization of the economy. So all these issues are looked at in a holistic way through a new tool of the green economy. That was one of the fundamental ways in which, and we are doing a lot of work in this, engaging the other partners, engaging the private sector, and so on. So this approach to sustainability through tools like the green economy was one of the fundamental sort of approaches on which a great deal of work is now being done in following up. The second was on another crown jewel from Rio+20 was the definition of sustainable development goals, where Rio mandated the task of developing these sustainable development goals. Some of you are aware of this. There was a question on this to the Deputy Secretary General. How do you fashion this rethink and reflect it in a set of sustainable development goals which bring this confluence of the people and the planet at the heart of the definition of a small set of goals? And the point is, what are these goals going to be, and how, unless they resonate with each and every one of you, for example, until they resonate with society in general, unless they resonate with policymakers, we will not have achieved a set of goals which will provide a beacon of this rethink of development. So the sustainable development goal work that is lying ahead is very fundamental. Then in terms of institutional framework, Rio had created a universal body for it's called the HighLevel Political Forum on Sustainable Development, and work is underway to create this body. And what is the objective of this body by creating a universal high-level political forum? I would say, in summary, it is to bring the same sense of engagement, the same elan of the Rio conference into the way in which the UN works on a more regular basis. There's no point just having a conference in every 20 years and trying to get that sense of engagement and elan and enthusiasm and engagement. It has to be a continuous process. So the challenge in creating this body, which reflects all these principles that I mentioned, the science-based evidence, the need to bring in civil society in general, the need for partnerships, the need for the private sector to engage, all this is the innovative way in which we hope we will create a body different from the traditional ways in which the UN engages these communities. So that was another significant outcome. Of course, in addition to these, we have the financing of sustainable development strategies. Nothing works without money, and clearly, but money is not only budgetary support from government to government. There are various ways in which everybody can mobilize money, innovative ways, in ways in which you can engage through partnerships. the Sustainable Energy for All initiative, for example, of the Secretary General, which had a framework for engagement on issues of energy, and now they have an implementation plan. Is that the right way to go? There is the Zero Hunger, which was launched at Rio+20. So all these were ways in which we can further the progress of Rio+20 and how we keep that in the political forum that we established. There are lots of voluntary initiatives that were launched at Rio. I just want to briefly touch upon them to give you the sense of what the other plural outcomes were. It was not just the outcome document, but the sense of engagement, policymakers, heads of state, civil society at large, the concerned community which gathered at Rio, and how they will remain engaged in carrying the messages of Rio forward. That is the basic challenge we have in front of us. I don't want to dwell too long on the minutiae of the other things, but I do want to refer to the 10-year framework on sustainable consumption and production that was launched at Rio, the work on corporate sustainability reporting that was sort of given a lot of attention at Rio. All these are important ways of injecting the sustainability into this heart of the rethink on sustainable development. And as we go forward and reimagining the way we need to develop, the way we need to look at our future, the way we need to look at our children's future and our grandchildren's future in this paradigm as we go ahead. So let me stop there, Rob. I'm just trying to give you a flavor of the amount of work that's going on, but I have not been able to detail everything that's going on, but I wanted to leave you with that idea that sustainability is something which is going to engage every part of every society. And our ability to keep that sense of engagement in the way we live, in the way we produce food, in the way we have our industrial development, in the way we engage, in the way we determine what cars we'll buy, the way we'll build our houses, the way we live, all that is part and parcel of the way we have to vision the future we want. So let me stop there, and in the subsequent course of discussions, I hope I'll be able to elaborate on the specifics of the kinds of other actions that have been taken in the follow-up to Rio+20. Thank you, Rob.
Great. Thank you, Nikhil. And I can say that I agree with Nikhil. I'm one of those that came away from Rio. I was fortunate enough to be there for Rio+20 that came away really with the glass half full, or maybe more than half full. I know there were lots of comments from different organizations and the disappointment about the outcome document, but a lot of these other activities that took place away from the intergovernmental process were really incredible to be a part of and see. There was a lot of progress with partnership, civil society activity, private sector, which I think that Nikhil can maybe get into a little bit more as we move forward with the conversation today. But right now, I'd like to turn to my colleague, who I'm very pleased was able to join us this morning, and I will say on relatively short notice, so thank you very much, Minh-Thu. Minh-Thu Pham is the Director of Public Policy at the UN Foundation and works with me here in our New York office. You can't really talk about what's going forward with whether it's the Sustainable Development Goals or the post-Rio process without talking about what's described around the UN as the post-2015 agenda. The MDGs set to expire in post-2015, and so the question is, what's going to come next? How are we going to fit all these important issues together again and continue to make progress towards achieving them? And Minh-Thu has been following that process very carefully. And Minh-Thu, can you just describe for us a bit about how that process is working, what we're looking to get done in the coming months and even years as we look at the different groups that are looking at the process and trying to come up with a clear path for our agenda?
Sure. Thank you, Rob, and thanks for having me here. I love coming into a room and seeing this many avid UN supporters, so really glad to be here and honored to be speaking to you all. Probably in this audience, I don't need to ask this question, but I'm going to anyway, just so that you can all see. How many of you know what the Millennium Development Goals are? Okay, great. I know that when I've gone to UNA chapters, on UN Day, almost every time I get a question about the Millennium Development Goals, and I think, obviously in this room, it looks like it's well over 50%, but we did a poll a couple of years ago of Americans and their general knowledge about the Millennium Development Goals, and I think only 1 in 10 actually had heard of them. But of course, if you poll the world, a lot more people around the planet know what the MDGs are. But obviously, in this room, we have an extra smart crowd. So with that, I just wanted to gauge that, because that's what this post-2015 process is about. And the phrase that Nikhil used is exactly right, this rethink of development. And what we would like to do when the Millennium Development Goals expire in 2015. As you all know, in 2000, the world leaders came to the UN and they agreed on a Millennium Declaration to look at how we in the new millennia address some of the big challenges in the world. And so they agreed to look at especially poverty issues as well as human rights and some other issues. And on the poverty agenda, there were, as you all also know, a whole decade of international conferences that led up to some outcomes, and the Millennium Development Goals were then pulled out of those into 8 very succinct goals that, if you were to sit down and describe them to your 13-year-old sister or to your grandfather or grandmother, that they would be able to understand it, and that you don't need to be a UN expert to get to understand that. And so, as a result, because they were simple, understandable, they became a very good galvanizing tool for the world's focus and attention on specific development objectives like halving poverty and getting girls in school and dealing with HIV, AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. And it also focused a lot of donor money, official development assistance towards these specific goals. And obviously, when you have a numerical goal, it's easier to measure your progress against them. And while some critics may say we haven't gone as far as we could have with achieving the MDGs, that for the most part we've actually done a pretty good job, and that they have been a very effective tool with getting us to achieve development. So while the MDGs have been progressing, we know that the deadline for the MDGs in 2015 is looming. And so in this Rio process that Nikhil just described is happening simultaneously as we think about, well, what happens when the Millennium Development Goals expire? And so now the UN has undergone a process to start thinking about that. And so I've described to you what were the sort of the takeaways, the sort of main lessons that were the accomplishments or the positives of the MDGs. But there were also weaknesses. The MDGs were not perfect. They only focused on a small set of issues. And some people say that, for instance, human rights issues, maybe the environmental issues were not as adequately addressed. Governance, reproductive health, maybe was an afterthought. And so there's a lot of things that people said, well, the MDGs were good, but they also ignored some very important issues. What happens in conflict and fragile states, et cetera. The other criticism of the MDGs was that when they were established, that process may not have been as inclusive as it could have been. For instance, maybe there could have been more civil society and NGO participation. Maybe, you could have had more folks from the private sector at the table too. Maybe we could have gauged the world as to what they actually thought their main development priorities were. And so this time around, coming up with the next set of development goals or the development agenda, the UN is really trying to correct that. And so, and part of it, just touching on what Nikhil said, this issue of people and planet, in 2000, we had a whole lot less people on the planet than we do now. As you all know, we've recently passed the 7 billion person mark on the planet, and of course, our Earth can only sustain so much if you think that every single person should be able to have a decent standard of living, which requires a certain amount of water and land resources and food and all the rest of it, and that this planet can only sustain so much. And so that's part of the reason why the process of developing the Millennium Development Goals after 2015 is now being thought of in a parallel track or at the same time as we think about Rio and the environmental agenda as well. And so now out of Rio, this broader definition of sustainable development, as Nikhil described, which includes the economic issues, the social issues like the that the MDGs cover, as well as, of course, the environmental issues is really important. And so, as I said, last time around, there were issues that the MDGs didn't address, and now this time we want to try to do that, as well as trying to make it a little bit more inclusive. And so on the chart that you see in front of you here is the UN foundations, and I'd say UNA as well. So our attempt at trying to visualize what the process is The Secretary General, as I said, he's very well aware of the criticisms of the MDGs, no matter how good of a tool they were, and trying to address that this time around. So trying to make the process as inclusive as possible. And so what Nikhil described to you is up there in the green. This is sort of what came out of Rio. I guess that's pink now. It used to be red, but anyway. The pink there in the middle is what the Secretary General has put in place. So he has established a group of 26 eminent persons as part of a high-level panel to give him advice and recommendations on what the post-2015 development goals or agenda should look like. And that panel right now is doing its work. It's supposed to come out with a report at the beginning of June. And then that would come to him, and he would sort of take that and decide what he likes or doesn't like in that report. And at the same time, the UN system, so UNDP, UNICEF, the World Health Organization, all of the sort of parts of the UN that you all know about, the UN Population Fund, et cetera, they have in that gray box under at the bottom there, come up with a whole series of consultations, including online, to try to get as much input from around the world as possible. And so, for instance, if any of you had a really strong opinion about where you think, for instance, the health agenda should go, you can go to www.worldwewant2015.org and post your views on there and say, here, this is what I think. www, I've been asked to repeat it, .worldwewant2015.org. Hopefully, I think it's, we'll try to circulate these somehow as well. But anyway, and there you can actually see it's a global online conversation about what the development agenda should look like. And so, I really encourage you to go and take a look at that. And they've broken it up into different issue areas: inequality and human rights, fragile states, environment, health, education, gender, you name it. And so those are consultations. And as I said, the first time around, the criticism of the MDGs were maybe that process wasn't as inclusive as it could have been. And this time around, the UN is doing a really great job. I think even civil society folks would really say the UN's really tried to open up this process. At the same time, there's also country-level consultation. So in over 60 countries in the world, the UN is holding meetings to try to get people's views as to what they think the agenda should look like. The second website I would point you all to is www.myworld2015.org, and that you can individually vote for your issue. So if you think, for instance, girls' education is the most important issue on the planet, then you can vote for that. Of course, you don't have to just vote for one. In fact, you can vote for 6 and put in your name and your age and where you're from, and then you can see across the world what other people think. And so I think that's actually a really interesting way that the UN's tried to open up this process. So what does all of this mean at the end of the day? I'm going to try to wrap up because I know that I think the questions that you all asked will be the most interesting part of this. And the bottom line, the light blue there at the bottom is all of the other ways that people around the world are trying to include their voices. So for instance, meetings like this one that UNA holds, or that the UN Foundation holds, or that civil society groups around the world hold to try to get views and then to feed into that process. And all of this is going to culminate into, you see the yellow over there, member states. So the UN has really 2 main roles around the world now. One is a convening capacity. The UN is really the only place where every country in the world, as well as civil society, as well as private sector, and anybody else can sit and discuss these issues. The UN has an ultimate convening power, and in particular member states, and so they are the ones who are going to decide on this agenda, so we want to make sure that they know what we think. And the second thing is as a norm-setting role, so trying to figure out, determine what the world's agenda should be. And so all that culminates into this yellow box here as to what the member states will come up with. And what they come up with is agreement. And I purposely put a question mark there because this is a very, this is an intergovernment, an international negotiation. And as you know, sometimes negotiations don't always end the way that they should. And so part of the question now is how broad do we make this agenda? As I said, people said certain issues were not included the first time around, and so they want to include those. But the positives about the MDGs were that they were simple and understandable. And now if you add in all of these other issues, will it then weigh the agenda down so much that we actually either can't get agreement, because goodness knows if you can't get agreement on climate change in the UN FCCC process, what makes you think you can get it in this process is something some people say, right? Or, for instance, agreement on trade, if you can't do it through the WTO, what makes you think you can do it in this process? But at the same time, you have to think about all these issues as interlinked. And so the question of whether or not we're going to have an agreement at the end of the day is a really big one. And so hopefully with your support and with the way that the process that Nikhil described, we can really try to make sure that we do balance people and planet and come out with something bold and meaningful at the end of the day. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Minh-Thu. And I think if there's a theme between what Nikhil and Minh-Thu have discussed, it's the fact that these processes, the fact that the UN is looking outside of just simple member processes to look for engagement from around the communities that care about this. There are a lot of stakeholders out there. Everyone needs to be heard and everyone needs to be made a part of this. And in fact, Minh-Thu's final comment lead us nicely. Lead us nicely? I'm okay, that's better. It's my glasses maybe creating some interference there. Lead us nicely into our next presentation by Eban Goodstein from Bard College. Eban, you're looking at the climate change issue, which Minh-Thu so nicely brought up at the end of her conversation there. And I think that there's a lot going on in that space, although that there maybe is a sense that with the UNFCCC process, the Conference of Parties meetings we'd all like to see that move a little bit faster, but there is activity going on out there. And if you could, give us a little conversation about what that looks like, where you see progress, where you see challenges in the climate agenda.
Thank you, Robb. It's a pleasure to be here. Here we go. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be among such strong supporters of the UN, because folks with an international perspective are going to be critical to getting us through the next few decades. So it seemed like a normal day outside, but there really aren't going to be any more normal days. We're alive at a truly extraordinary moment in human history, in the sense that the decisions that we're going to be making collectively over our working lives are going to have profound impacts, and not only on our own lives and the lives of our children, but in fact for every human being who's ever going to walk the face of the planet from now until the end of time. How many of y'all are under 30? Hold up your hands. Okay, I get to work with people under 30 in my job as director of graduate programs at Bard College. And I turned 53 this year. I work with 23, 24-year-olds, so I tend to think in terms of 30s. And 30 years from now, it's going to be the year 2043. I'll be 83. You guys will be my age. And at that time, we're really going to know in some profound way the future of the Earth, right? We're going to know whether there's going to be 9 or 10 or 11 billion people on the planet, but we're going to know more fundamentally how hot it's going to get, and whether global warming is going to drive the planet 4 degrees Fahrenheit hotter within your lifetimes, or 12 degrees Fahrenheit hotter. And to put those numbers in perspective, during the last ice age, when this particular office building was covered by about 1,000 feet of ice, the world was only 9 degrees Fahrenheit colder than it is right now. So over our lifetimes, we collectively have got to forestall a swing in global temperatures of ice age magnitude only in the opposite direction. It's a daunting task. It involves rewiring the entire world with clean energy, redesigning cities across the planet, reimagining the global food system. But it's nice to be in this room, because the UN is a place that has never shied away from extraordinary vision and imagination. So that's the direction that we have to go. Now, I direct 2 graduate programs at Bard College. One is a policy program. The other is a new business program in sustainable business, so this green economy idea that was introduced earlier. And when I talk to students who are coming into these programs, I say there's really kind of 2 career directions you can take to save the planet. Of course, the planet will be fine. We don't really need to worry about the planet. Just give it a few million years and it'll fix any problems we create. But, save the planet for our children and grandchildren. You can pursue a career in policy, and that's really about changing the rules of the game, right? At the national level, the international level, global, regional, local. Or you can pursue a career in sustainable business, and that's a new idea. But sustainable business, the idea here is this is for people who want to play the game. Within the existing rules, build solutions that solve environmental and social problems, try and scale those problems. And what I want to talk about today is kind of the interplay between civil society, business, and politics and policy in the context of solving this climate problem. Just to put it in perspective, this report came out from the World Bank just last month. It says we're on track for a 4°C world by the end of the century. That's twice what the international community has designated as the goal and a safe operating space. And this would mean that we would be thickening the carbon blanket that surrounds the planet to around 800 parts per million by the end of the century. We're now about 400. And to give you a sense of what this means, and I think it's important we hold this in our minds, this is some work that was recently done by the National Center for Atmospheric Research out in Colorado of what that kind of world might look like. And the big impact here is drought. Drought is going to be sort of a defining feature of climate change, especially in our part of the world. So I just want to show you a picture of what the world might look like when you guys in the back of the room who are under 30 are hitting retirement age. So this is the 2060, 2070 forecast. It's not like the future's locked in, but this is a direction that scientists think we might go. If you look at the colors on the map, sort of darker than the magenta or the brown there is what's known as extreme drought. And in the period 2000 to 2009, there was only one place in South Dakota in the United States that was in that brown color, extreme drought. So this is a story that scientists tell about what the world might look like in 60 or 70 years if we don't change direction. And it's not a good story, basically all the way from Virginia up to the Great Lakes and across over into Canada, and then down through South America, Central America, into the Amazon basin. All of that goes into extreme drought if we hit that sort of 4°C warming trajectory that the World Bank says we're on. This is the kind of picture that we can't forget about. Because ultimately this is the future that we do not want our children and grandchildren to inherit. So how do we avoid that track? How do we get out of that position? Again, I want to talk about the interface between business and politics in some measure because the political process seems to have broken down around this issue. There was a lot of hope through the 2000s that we would build towards a fair and binding global warming treaty in Copenhagen. It did not happen. Since that time, we've sort of retreated to a series of relatively weak national commitments, many of which are not even being met. And so we really don't seem to be making the kind of progress that we need to redirect the trajectory of the planet at this point. There's opportunities for all of us to engage as citizens. I would urge you all to go down to Washington, D.C. on February 17th and participate in a large-scale protest outside the White House. I don't know if I can do that here. Is that fair? Please check that out at 350.org. But I want to talk about this idea of green business a little bit. Sustainable business is a vision that emerged relatively recently in the history of the business sector. And traditionally, businesses have viewed environmental and social problems as costs to be externalized, not things that they were worried about. And the job of a business was to make as much money as possible while obeying the law. But beginning in the late 70s and really taking off in the 90s, really taking off in the 2000s, this idea of sustainable business began to grow. And the idea was, instead of looking at environmental and social problems as costs to be externalized, let's think of them as profit opportunities, as problems to be profitably solved. Because if they can be profitably solved, then those solutions can be scaled, and they can have the kind of global impact that we need. Couple of examples. My favorite green business these days is just north of me up in Troy, New York. It's a company called Ecovative, and they set out to remove styrofoam from the face of the planet. And now styrofoam is an example of how we can't meet the needs of 9 billion people in a world of limited resources. To make styrofoam, you've got to drill in sensitive habitat in the Niger Delta or the Gulf of Mexico, spill oil, bring it across the ocean, risk spilling it again, heat it up to high temperatures, create toxics, poison the workers, poison the communities, chop it up into peanuts when you're ready to ship it or use it to make packaging for computers, send it around. It has a useful life of consumers for about 3 weeks. Then they throw it away. No such thing as throwing things away, but that's what we do. And it lasts for 10,000 years. So Ecovative said this is not the way to do things. How can we do this differently? And they said, how would nature do this? And this is a critical dimension of sustainable business. How would nature do this? So now they grow large blocks of mushrooms in room temperature in dark rooms, and then they kill the mushrooms with heat, and then they chop them up for shipping peanuts, or they use it to mold and put around computers. And they're on their way to replacing styrofoam from the face of the planet with a much more environmentally benign product. So this is the vision of sustainable business. And the question is, how can business begin to take this, or this relatively small sector? I mean, sustainability is, you hear it in every corporate boardroom. There's not a lot of companies that are really doing it with the seriousness that it demands, but there's a lot of companies who have their toe in the water and are curious about this issue. So in thinking about the talk today, I was thinking, what kind of impact can sustainable business have to revive the policy and political process at the national level? Because really, without strong national movements around climate change, there'll be no way for the international process ultimately to be able to impact the debate. And Microsoft recently came up with a very interesting internal policy proposal. Microsoft instituted a carbon tax within their company. So the idea is, if you run a business unit in Microsoft and you want to send a team to China, you've got to pay for their gas and their plane tickets and their hotel rooms, but you also have to pay an amount, I think it's $5 a ton for every ton of carbon that's emitted by that team. Now, this is going to have the effect, obviously, of reducing travel and other carbon-intensive activities on the part of Microsoft, also creating a fund that the company is going to use to invest in renewable energy to make itself more self-sufficient and reliant as it tries to unhook from fossil fuels. So why would a company do this? Why would they tax themselves? And the answer is, because they're going to make money. This is going to be a profitable innovation. I'm sure we all operate in environments where, if we look around at the number of plane flights that our organizations are taking, they're probably too many, because travel is kind of a perk for a lot of people, and folks do more traveling than's maybe absolutely necessary for the business. So this is a way for Microsoft to get their hands around waste. Waste in terms of travel, waste in terms of energy use. They're going to become a more efficient company. They're going to wind up saving money, and they're going to find those $20 bills on the sidewalk by instituting this carbon policy. Okay? So taxes, as you know, in the United States and in many places, are a challenging policy idea for policymakers. Not a good word. But suppose that the companies, many of whom were at Rio+20, Unilever, Nike, Boeing, Procter & Gamble, Johnson & Johnson, suppose each of those companies decided to follow Microsoft's lead and began to install their own internal carbon taxes, right? Well, if you have much of the global business sector implementing this kind of policy, then that makes it safe for governments at the national level, and ultimately governments at the international level, to really begin to talk about the kind of price policies that are ultimately going to be needed to drive the dramatic reductions, the 80% cuts in carbon emissions that we're going to need by the time I turn 83 to get our hands around this global warming problem. So it's this kind of creative interaction and ambitious and visionary action that needs to emerge from the sustainable business community, needs to emerge from civil society in terms of pressure on national governments to ultimately make it possible for international negotiations to succeed. I think we were all naive in the 2000s to think that without a strong grassroots base at the national level that we would get the kind of fair and binding climate treaty that we certainly hoped for in 2010. So this is my daughter, Emma and Liza, and I do this because of them, a lot of the work I do. Emma's going to medical school next year. So she's 20 years older than in this picture. But my point here is that 20 years goes by very, 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 very quickly. We don't have a lot of time. And so we need to remember that we are living an extraordinary moment and really not waste a day in envisioning and imagining these scalable opportunities that can build solutions and also influence policy. Thank you.
All right. right, thank you, Eban, particularly for bringing it home to the very personal level at the end, which I think is important. In the end, it's all about people and how we're going to live together on this planet going forward. And of course, it's okay to plug what we can do to take action and make our governments around the world know that we care about these issues. So February 17th is certainly a fair enough plug, because it tells us all where we should all be on that day if we care about climate change and we care about the U.S. government really engaging in taking some action to make some movement on that. Okay, we've got a great overview so far of the process around these issues going forward, where we've been in the last year and where we need to go. I think I'm going to do a bit of a quick speed round before we open the floor. Again, we want to make sure we have the opportunity to take your questions. And as you're thinking about your questions, it looks like we're taking them from the microphones up front here, which I think you saw in the previous session. So, but first I'm going to go quickly back around with the panel one more time. I'm going to go back to Nikhil. You kind of finished with talking about some of these initiatives that came out of Rio. It could engage different stakeholders, and I think, similarly to the questions I'm going to ask, both Minh-Thu and Eban as well, is describe some of those initiatives and let us know a little bit how we can all engage in them. What can we do in terms of, as citizens, as people who care about the issues, and in terms of helping the process, but also engaging in the specific activities that came out of Rio.
Rob, the problem with giving a UN person the floor is that he never sticks to the strict guidelines that the moderator might want. So I want to exploit my floor now to address three sets of issues. One, of course, the question you asked, but I want to also elaborate a little more on what Minh-Thu and Eban have said in terms of how I see some of these issues evolving, and to try and give a little better conceptual understanding of the link between MDGs, SDGs, and also on climate change. Can the world really wait till the last I and the last T last I has been dotted and the last T has been crossed on the negotiations on a treaty? And that's a very complex process. So I do want to comment on these three. On initiatives, Rio+20 did emphasize the strength and the importance of voluntary initiatives. In fact, 700 new voluntary commitments were announced at the end of the Rio+20 conference, contributing over $500 billion to sustainable development action. And since then, the initiatives recorded have gone up to 1372. And these include voluntary commitments, partnerships, and green economy initiatives. We too have a website where you can see all these. It's called the Sustainable, if you Google Sustainable Development Knowledge Portal, you'll come to our website where we have recorded all these. This is a comprehensive registry of voluntary initiatives, and it's a good source to be able to see who's doing what and what are the kinds of initiatives. There is the high-profile things here, of course, are three which I wanted to quickly mention. One is the initiative on sustainable transportation, and that was $175 billion pledged over the next 10 years by the Asian Development Bank and some of the regional and multilateral development banks. All of you who've been to urban areas, particularly in the developing world, know the problem of urban congestion and the kind of health and other issues that is raising. And that initiative basically addresses the problem of sustainable transportation. The Secretary General's own initiative on sustainable energy for all was also a very high-profile activity, which built on this idea of everybody being involved in finding solutions. It can't be legislated by governments alone, clearly, until the business sector, till civil society at large, till common citizenry engage in doing these things differently, we won't make much progress. And the third high-profile thing which I want to mention, I can't really list all these 1372 initiatives which you can see, but was the Zero Hunger announcement which was made at Rio+20. And these are the kind of initiatives and the big high-profile initiatives which we are following up on. I think on all voluntary initiatives, it's very important to give a segue and a place for them to be reporting back into. Because at the heat of the political excitement of a conference, people do make a lot of initiatives and announcements, but their follow-up is often very weak, and we're hoping that the high-level political forum that we'll establish will keep that sense of continuity between what we did at Rio and how we want to see it followed up. The two other things I want to quickly talk about is what are the major challenges really as I see it. I would say that the biggest threats to our world today, of course, I'm not going into the political the social and other things, are the issues of water. These are interlinked issues. Water, energy, food, and their pernicious link with climate change. And the interface between these are so frightening when you look at the data and what's happening, and I think Eban pointed to some of those, that these have to be addressed. And how can we really wait for the climate treaty to be finalized to what's going to happen in 2015, taking effect much later, 5 years later? I would say no. If you take action on the whole range of things that were recommended in Rio, whether it was cities or water or disaster resilience or energy or food, or so many other sectoral and cross-sectoral actions, you will be contributing to this, to helping solve the climate issue without waiting for a treaty to be signed. And the treaty is complex because of the historical, sort of liability issues and so on. It won't be very easy to come to an agreement, but we cannot wait for that. And that's what I would urge, that all of us try and propagate that need for being able to take actions which will, through softer law like Rio+20, which is more recommendatory in nature than waiting for hard law to come out of something like a treaty. Let's do something about it rather than just wait for something else to be able to trigger action. And finally, what I wanted to mention is that, the MDGs were great. They helped us focus on vital issues, on hunger, on poverty, on gender equality and empowerment, on health, on education. But they didn't get this interlinkage right. Let me give an example on food. In my own country, in India, we did manage to solve the problem of food by, what did we do? We pumped in water, chemical fertilizer, seed, pesticides. But was that the sustainable way to go about it? I'm not that sure anymore, because 30, 40 years down the road, we find everything is going wrong. The productivity of the soil, the runoffs into the rivers, the nitrogenous runoffs. So we've got to get this right ab initio. When we start our policies, we've got to make sure that these economic, social, environmental issues are woven in. Let's look at the issue of health. Of course, there are 3 MDGs relating to health. But what is the biggest killer of children today? It's water, dysentery, and pulmonary stuff which comes from bad air. Now, if you look at the prevention aspect of preventing child death from the 0 to 5, unless you tackle the issue of unsafe drinking water and the air quality, especially with dirty cook stoves in people's houses, how are you going to address that? So I think the vision of the SDGs has to be one which weaves in the environmental, the economic, and social dimension right from the beginning. That is the message that I want to leave you with, and that's the design of the SDGs, which from the beginning stresses this crucial interface between these issues, which can be the only basis for sound decision-making. Thank you, Rob.
Great, thank you, Nikhil. And I never expect anyone to ever answer my questions, so, but I think actually you did, with all 3 of your points, all well taken, because they do describe what we need to know and what we need to do, and I think that's what we all came here to hear today. Now, Minh-Thu, you talked a lot about the process, what we're looking at, and I think sometimes it can appear confusing. There's a lot of different lines and different arrows on that diagram, but in truth, it really isn't that confusing. It's all headed for a destination, and it's all meant to be inclusive. And I would also note that put out a shout out a bit to the Millennium Campaign and UNDP, who are leading the process of really bringing the outside stakeholders in through the My World site and the World We Want site to make sure that people are there, and they've really led that and done a nice job with it to make sure it's understandable, it's a nice site, it's easily managed. But in that process, there are going to be some milestones along the way that I think that among the consultations, certain activities taking place. What are some of those dates and moments that we all need to be aware of, and how can, outside of the websites, can maybe the citizens and the folks here in the room today engage?
Great, thanks, Rob. I'll try to be quick. I think milestones, so the Secretary General's high-level panel is coming out with its report at the end of May, early June. The Secretary General himself will have his own report sometime, I think, in September this year. And the Sustainable Development Goals Working Group will also come out with a report, I think an interim report or something, and Nikhil knows this better than I do, I think sometime in September. And so that's the sort of the first real substantive contribution as to what we think will be part of this agenda. And then, of course, the member states have some time over the next year or two to negotiate this. And then in 2015, at the summit in September in 2015, they will hopefully come to some agreement. But that said, I think the most important milestone is the achievement of the MDGs in 2015. So all of this talk about what comes afterwards is important, but even more important is achieving what we've already said we were going to do. The credibility of coming up with what comes with the post-2015 MDGs is purely dependent on how well we do, for the most part, dependent on how well we do on the MDGs, on the promises we've already said we are going to make. Why would anybody in the world believe us if we said, oh, well, we made these promises 13 years ago, and, we're not going to really get there, but let's just think about what comes afterwards. There's no credibility there. And so I think our first job is to just achieve what we've already said we are going to do. And so to the extent that you all can encourage, obviously, our national leaders here, as well as working with the organizations that we partner with, to really try to achieve the MDGs, I think that is really the biggest milestone. And as I said, the credibility of post-2015, the credibility of the UN is largely on that. And of course, there's some areas where we may not be able to achieve the MDGs, but we've got to try to do it as much as possible. And then the other is, as Nikhil mentioned, follow-up. On the issues that you care about, link in with the organizations that you know that are working on that. So for instance, Save the Children on children's issues and health issues, and try to help advance the conversation and try to get them to sort of follow up on the things that they said they would do. And then, of course, the websites. There are groups around the country that will be meeting on post-2015, and so I encourage you, I think we've been talking about doing something around the annual conference this year for UNA to, again, touch base on this agenda, and so we'd be happy to talk with you about that. But I think anything that you all can do to help us to achieve the MDGs is really important. Thank you.
Yeah, and Joanna, that's very important. The MDGs are not over yet, and there's still a couple of years to really make some good advancements on and coming close to achieving them and achieving them in some cases. So that really does need to be the initial focus. Eban, you talked a lot about some of the private sector actors that are doing some good things in engaging on the climate change issue. I'm curious as to how can we find out who are the companies that are doing good things, and also how can we find out who are some that are doing bad things that we may or may not know about, and as citizens pressure those companies, and also get our government to pressure these companies to implement better business practices. Is there a way that you would recommend that we all work at that?
There's a number of outlets. On the climate issue in particular, there's an organization called climatecounts.org that rates companies based on their commitment to reducing their own carbon footprint as well as their engagement with public policy. And for folks who are interested in this whole idea of sustainable business, there's a website or a blog, greenbiz.org, that really follows folks at the cutting edge and gives you a sense of the people who are doing really interesting work. I'm sorry, greenbiz.org? Greenbiz.org. That's sort of the main website and blog for the green business community. I think more broadly, there's this question of the relationship between voluntary action and engaging businesses as consumers, and then also acting as citizens to get government to more systematically engage companies. I think at the end of the day, we're not going to solve the climate crisis through voluntary action. Dr. King his focus wasn't on getting people to sort of have nice conversations with racists, right? It was about, passing the Civil Rights Act and legal changes that really ultimately built a culture that's more inclusive and tolerant and has led, to the election of an African-American president. But it was those legal changes that ultimately created the structure that achieved that. So we always have to keep our eye on the prize, which is in terms of how do we build the political support for the policy changes that can actually have broad sweeping change, create broad sweeping change in our culture and society. That said, there's always room for us to walk our talk in terms of our consumption decisions and in terms of choices we make about energy use and the cars we drive. There's lots of resources on the web that can help you out in that direction.